Alice Sebold is here. Her first novel, The Lovely Bones, was published earlier this year. It tells a story of a 14-year-old girl who is raped and murdered by a serial killer who lives in her neighborhood. The book has sold over 1 million copies and is currently #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The New Yorker magazine calls it, quote, a stunning achievement. I am pleased to have Alice Sebold at this table for the first time. And I also should say that many people believe that this is the best thing they've read in a while. And the one thing I will not ask you is, are you surprised by all this? I mean, if there's anything self-evident,
that's clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If there's anything self-evident, is that no one could expect, writing a first novel and it would have this kind of reaction. Tell me about where the story came from.
Well, I always feel strange about the answer because it's true and yet disappointing, which is it just came out of nowhere. I was working on another novel, which I think was kind of competent, but that's about it, and was frustrated with it, and I went off to read poetry, which is something I do to kind of break up the narrative line in my head, and I went back to the desk, and Susie's voice was there. And I wrote the first chapter of the book. It's been rewritten, but very much her voice was there. She told me where she was speaking from, what had happened to her, and some of the other elements of her life.
Wait a minute. She told you.
Right. I mean,
she told you all that in one session, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's just something mysterious about the creative process, which is almost impossible to explain, even to yourself. Because you get done. In my case, I finished what was about 15 pages written in one sitting, and I called a friend of mine and read it to him over the phone. And kind of was saying to him, what is this? What's your response to this? Because it was very different from anything I had been writing or that he had read. He said, I don't know what it is, but keep doing it. So.
I don't know what it is, but keep doing it.
Right, exactly. Like there's no way to quantify it.
And could you keep doing it? In other words, once you had the rhythm of her voice,
I think
you had this.
I had a lovely teacher who said something, Jeffrey Wolf. He said, once you get a voice in your head, if you can just stay true to the voice, you will never lose it. But you may not lose it, but it goes hiding, and you have to keep coming back to it. And so I drafted a lot of pages that were not in the book, ultimately, because they lapsed into other voices. But she was my guiding voice.
Now, do you now believe, as someone who's been writing and thinking about writing and thinks about it a lot, that you can't find the voice has to find you?
Yes, I do believe that, yeah. I mean, you can sit down and for 10 days and write. I mean, you should always write, and voices may only come to you once every 6 to 7, either months or years, depending on who you are.
Yeah, exactly. Some people never.
Right, but you have to have the discipline to be sitting there so that when the voice does come, you're actually available to it. Otherwise, it'll never happen. Why
do you think her voice so resonates with readers?
I've heard a lot of different things. There is something, I mean, in my own thought process, I do think of that age of 14 as a real truth-telling age. You have adult perceptions that are just beginning to come to you, but also you don't have any censor. There's no societal censor. You haven't learned what you should say or shouldn't say. So when you see something, you just immediately say, this is the way it is. I mean, there's no bullshit in a 14-year-old perspective. And so I think readers are drawn to that. Here's something horrible, let's look at it. As strange as that may sound, and certainly strange to me because I wasn't expecting that they would be drawn to it, but I'm glad they are. It kind of renews my belief.
So a child's voice has a certain absence of bullshit, also authenticity, and I don't know what else describes it, but I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, just very straight shooting.
Straightforward. Yeah, there's no pretension, there's no cover, there's no whatever.
Right.
Now, when did you know she was in heaven?
When I wrote that first chapter. Again, that was something she told me.
She told you that right away. She said, here, I'm up here. And,
she was very bossy.
I'll tell you what it's like. Oh, she was?
Yeah, in a great way. I mean, when you have something like that feels strong coming out of your hands, you cede yourself over to whatever that voice or that character wants you to do.
Okay, if you had heard this 5 years earlier, could you have done this? I mean, has anything happened to you in the last 5 years that made you more able to hear the voice, to listen to the voice, to project the voice?
I think I wrote my memoir, Lucky, which is about my own rape and trial, which was something, I mean, if I had not written that book, I would not have written this book. I started this book first, but I needed to get my story out, and as soon as I got my story out in a way, then Susie could be, you know, kind of borne aloft and really have her own way. I mean, you know, she's bossy to the extent that I feel that she's responsible for me even writing my own memoir, because she didn't want my stuff clouding up her own book.
Before I go too much further, tell me what we can say about this. I mean, you're the writer, and I don't want to go take this somewhere where you don't want me to go, but it is, after all, it's a novel, and it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it is the story of a murder, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what we can say. Did you know, did she tell you where the whole thing, who did it and where it went and all that in the beginning? Or did you
no,
I just want to know exactly what's Susie.
No, I mean, when I say, in other words, she told me where she was, so she was in heaven, you know, basically who she was.
How old she was and who she was.
And how she had died. So those were the things I knew, and I also knew some of the names of her family. By the end of the 15 pages. But dynamics past that point, I didn't know.
That's when, then once you took it forward in your own imagination.
Right.
Is the end as good as the beginning?
You're asking the writer that.
No, I am, because sometimes people say that, you know, if you were so inspired, that it's hard to duplicate it throughout the book when you had her only speaking to you in the first 2 chapters.
Right. Well, she was speaking to me throughout, but it wasn't like automatic writing, in other words.
You weren't just quickly scrolling down what she said.
Right, exactly.
You were then sort of exploring your own consciousness to figure out where that voice would take it.
Right. All I can say about the ending is Susie is solidly there at the ending. She doesn't go away. And that was why, I mean, it took me longer to write the book than it would have if I just was kind of going from point A to point B, because I wanted to make sure that I was telling her story. And not just concluding a book.
When did you start this?
I started in 1995.
Yeah, because you know what some people are saying. You got one hell of a sense of timing.
Right. Well,
you know, because the media has been full of tragic stories of young girls being kidnapped.
Right. But you know what? The world has been full of them for a very long time.
It's just they've got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Now, does one? It just happened that. Why are we having so much attention now? What is it that makes it so?
I don't know. I mean, I think
I assume you're right. It hadn't been any more. I mean, there's
no. And actually, people who do statistics would tell you that there are slightly fewer this year than there were like a couple years ago.
It seems to me like they're more publicized than I can ever remember.
Oh, totally. I mean, certainly in any idea that I've ever had of them. But I just think the media gets a hold of something, and I think there was one high-profile case, and then they realized, wait a minute, they're all high-profile. This is the death of a child here, or the loss of a child.
And then there's some things people just, somehow hit so close to a certain spot that there's huge curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. And I also do kind of believe that things have changed a little bit in the country, and so that there's this desire to face horror head-on a little bit more than there might have been a couple years ago when we were still, buying the next SUV.
What do we know about Mr. Harvey? Who, I mean, did Susie's voice tell you that, or?
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, Susie's voice told me everything ultimately, because it's she's the drive of the book.
Right.
Yeah,
she's the connective.
Right, exactly. It's just whether the signal was clear or not is really the difference. What we know about
understanding his motivations, understanding
what we know
why
about
he was the way he was.
What we know about him, I think, is that, or what I would like readers to feel they know about him, is that he's somebody who does horrible things, who also tries not to do those horrible things, but is not able to stop himself. There's no explanation.
Stop me before I murder again.
Right. There's no explanation given for, well, he did this because he was not fed, muesli as a child. Yeah. Because those things are all
Or because he was abused as a child,
right,
or because of whatever.
Exactly. And what everybody would say is there are plenty of people who are abused as a child who don't grow up to murder young children. And so I didn't want to provide an explanation because I don't think we know the explanations, and I think that's what makes it very frightening.
You don't mean not only about him, but in general.
Right.
We don't understand.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
how do you explain?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think if we knew it, then people would be less horrified by the idea because they'd feel they could do something to stop
How do you
it.
explain? You know, I mean, it just. How do you explain the murder of innocence?
Right. Exactly.
Right.
You can't.
How much have you talked about your own personal experience on the subject of rape?
I've talked about it a fair amount. I certainly haven't talked about it as much as I've talked about
Alice. I mean, I talked about Susie.
Right, exactly. But you know, I did a thing like last year for the Brooklyn DA's office and the NYPD, and
What's the thing?
like I was a keynote speaker
Yeah.
at a group, you know, convention or meeting that they had here in Manhattan, and so I've done things like that.
Now, is there a connection between your being raped, your experience, and hearing Susie's voice?
I think in that way that anybody who survives something where other people don't survive it, you always think about those. I mean, you know, the easy thing to call it is survivor guilt. I mean, you always think about those people who didn't survive similar experiences. And so for years I've been obsessed with the idea that there are so many dead girls that their photos are in the paper, but you never know anything about them, and they've lost their voice because they're dead. And so I definitely think I'm you know, that's an obsession of mine or a drive of mine. So there's a connection.
What's the drive to
give them a voice?
Because I'm trying to get, I want to get my hands around, if I can, this idea of hearing a voice. I mean, that is,
Right.
I don't, and I appreciate it, respect it, and hear you. I mean, and how it happens and how much it's informed by what's happened, what life's experiences.
Right.
You know, I mean, what is about life's experiences that had you hear this voice?
Well, you know, I do think that the voices come out of what I call, for lack of a better word, the subconscious stew. I mean, there's no way to know exactly how that process works, even for me. You know, I mean, I may be the person who wrote the book, but that doesn't mean I can explain how it happened. All I can say is, you know, if you walk down the road and there's some like, beautiful puddle on the ground, you don't know where it came from, but you take the opportunity to enjoy it and look at it. And I think that's the same thing for me. Is if something presents itself, I'm going to try to do my best to be equal to it. So for me, the voice is a challenge as well. You know, it's are you equal to being able to write the story that this voice is saying they want to give you or tell you?
Your memoir was about?
My memoir is about my rape at 18 and the trial that followed it. So, and you know, growing up, a lot of people have also said who've read it, it's also an interesting journey of a writer, like how one becomes a writer.
Your memoir?
Yeah, you know, because it's also, for instance, I had a wonderful teacher, actually Jeffrey Wolf's brother, Tobias Wolf, as a Syracuse student, and I saw him right after I had seen the rapist on the street, and you know, I went to report that I wasn't able to come to class because I was going to have to call the police. And he, at the time, which I didn't know until years later, was working on his memoir, This Boy's Life.
Right.
And the only thing he could tell me in that moment was, you know, try if you can to remember everything. And so, you know, that's a little seed that he planted that I could go back to years later and think he had a purpose for that. And, you know, and he was giving me what he could. And in a way that you know, that was something that helped me as a writer, you know, to have that example of that person who was trying to remember difficult times in his own past and make work out of it.
What happened after you saw the rapist?
Basically, he was arrested. We went into the trial process, things like that. But, you know, you drive around in the car with the cops and look for him to see if he's still in the area. And, of course, he never is. You know, the usual.
It's just, I haven't read your memoir, so I'm,
right.
You know, it's, what's the title of it?
Lucky.
Lucky, as you said earlier in this conversation.
Right.
Is it destined to the success of this book to influence a reprint of that book?
Well, Lucky never came out in paperback, and now it's in
now
paper.
Paperback. So you can get this and get that in
yeah,
paperback.
But that's a.
Should they be read together, you think?
I can't be the judge on that. really, I think they serve different purposes, and I certainly wrote them in very different ways. So.
You have said somewhere that you engaged in self-destructive habits for 10 years.
It wasn't
before you were able to
it wasn't
face
quite,
the reality.
It wasn't.
Maybe 10 years is a wrong.
Yeah, 10 years is a little long, but I mean, in other words, the volume on how bad they were was really high for about 2.5 years, and
the self-destructive habit, what?
I snorted heroin and drank too much, and just dated people that perhaps were not the best.
Right choice for you.
Right, exactly. Nothing that a lot of people who haven't had my experience haven't done as well.
Sure.
And
but understandably so, except.
Right, and it's all
you're hurting yourself.
Right, exactly. It's all the way in which you're doing it, and if you drink and throw up every time you drink, then that's not really having a good time.
No.
No,
or if you risk an overdose with heroin, that's not having a good time either.
Right. I did a lot of that, and I've.
How'd you come out of that?
One of the things that really helped me was to read in the New York Public Library. I met a man who was a World War II veteran, and who had a really delayed response to losing a lot of his fellow soldiers. And he suggested that I read some firsthand accounts of the Vietnam War, because you can get more of those than of World War II in terms of transcripts. And so I went to the New York Public Library, and I was reading this one particular experience of this man who had been extremely heroic in battle, and then had come home and was still heroic. And then about 7 or 8 years after that, he just absolutely collapsed. And it's because he hadn't dealt with all the stuff that had happened to him. He was the strong one, and kind of made a great case for, here he's a hero, he went through all that hell, but he's strong, and, yada, yada, yada. And so reading the transcripts of Vietnam vets who were self-medicating.
Where do you get transcripts?
You can get them, I mean, they've been printed by small presses. You just look them up in the New York Public Library, and you sit in the reading room and read them there. That just led me to, they just felt very much like my experience in some way. And of course that led me to the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I could recognize my issues in their issues.
Anna Quinlan, who you're going to have lunch with, some say that her enthusiastic, I don't know who some is, but maybe your agent, I don't know who, somebody who keeps up with bestsellers, said that the turning point, the tipping point, was when Anna went on the Today Show and said, here's what she said: destined to become a classic in the vein of To Kill a Mockingbird. That's not bad.
It isn't. I got to close my ears every time. I can't handle it. So,
can't?
Yeah, no, just...
Better you not hear this.
Yeah,
okay, shut your ears. Michael Chabon, who wrote The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, said, one of the strangest experiences I've had as a reader in a long time, one of the most memorable, painfully funny, bracingly tough, terribly sad, a feat of imagination and a tribute to the healing power of Greece. Look at this cover. This is the #1 bestseller in America, a book that sold more than 1 million copies, which is not the achievement. The achievement is that it is a powerful read, and more and more people want to go for that experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.